Death Among the Halloween Lanterns, a Miss Marple Mystery. Dear listeners, welcome to Detective Notebook. I'm Sam, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you here for another captivating tale. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop it in the comments below. I always enjoy discovering where our wonderful community is tuning in from. If you enjoy these cozy mysteries, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and ring the bell so you never miss another evening in St. Mary. Now, let's get cozy and start tonight's story. Chapter 1. Morning in the Village. The morning crept gently over St. Mary Mead, the kind of pale, silvery dawn that made the village seem suspended between sleep and waking. A thin mist lingered over the hedgerows, softening every edge, turning the world into watercolour. The church bell had just chimed 8 when Miss Marple drew her curtains aside. The glass was cool beneath her fingertips, and she noted how the fog clung to the rooftops as if reluctant to let the night go. Down in the lane, the milk cart rattled faintly, its driver whistling a tune too cheerful for such a sombre morning. By the time she reached the breakfast table, the kettle was whistling. She poured herself a cup of tea, dark and comforting, then added a single slice of toast to her plate. There was something grounding about simple rituals after tragedy. One must begin the day somehow, even when death had paid a visit so near. A soft knock sounded at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, wrapped in a shawl the colour of plums, her cheeks flushed from the chill. "I couldn't stay away, Jane," she said, stepping inside. "The whole village is talking of nothing else." Miss Marple gestured her friend toward the hearth where the fire had just begun to catch. "Naturally," she replied, settling opposite her. "News travels faster than common sense in St. Mary Mead." They shared a faint, knowing smile. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, eyes bright with curiosity despite her solemn tone. "They've identified him. The poor man from last night, Mr. Leonard Pike, retired schoolmaster apparently. Rented the cottage near the green just 3 months ago." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Yes, I remember noticing his curtains, blue chintz, quite modest. He seemed a quiet sort. Always carried a book, if I recall." "That's just it, Mrs. Bantry. No one knew him. Not a soul seems to have spoken more than 2 words to the man. And now this dreadful business at the fete. I can hardly believe it. Murder, right here among our lanterns." Outside, the fog pressed closer to the window panes, muting the world. Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly against each other as she began a line of knitting without glancing down. "It is curious," she said after a moment. "People assume that danger wears loud colours, but in my experience it often dresses in grey." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "Do you think he was mixed up in something?" "Oh, I shouldn't like to jump to conclusions," Miss Marple said mildly. "But new people bring new stories and sometimes new secrets. One never quite knows what follows a moving van." A pause settled between them, filled only by the pop of the fire. Mrs. Bantry sipped her tea and frowned into the flame. "The inspector will be here this morning. Poor Craddock, he'll have his hands full. Half the village claims to have seen a cloaked figure, and the other half insists it was only shadows." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Shadows do have a way of confessing to things they never did." They both chuckled softly, though their laughter faded quickly. The memory of last night still hung in the air, the lanterns swinging in the wind, the sudden scream, the sharp scent of smoke and cider turning to something far more metallic. Miss Marple had been there, of course, close enough to see the panic ripple through the crowd like wind through grass. Yet even then her mind had worked quietly, noting details others missed. The torn ribbon, the missing lantern, the way the vicar's clock struck 9 just before the commotion began. "Do you suppose," Mrs. Bantry asked hesitantly, "that whoever did it might still be among us?" "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, setting down her cup, "whoever commits such an act is always among us. That's what makes it so very unsettling. Evil seldom comes from elsewhere. It grows where it is least expected." Mrs. Bantry drew her shawl closer. "You make it sound as though it could be anyone." "Perhaps not anyone," Miss Marple replied, "but someone." Someone who smiled politely, admired the lanterns, and waited for the perfect moment when no one was looking. She resumed her knitting, her needles glinting in the light. There's always something about the quiet ones, don't you think? Mrs. Bantry didn't answer at once. She stared out through the fog at the dim outline of the green, where a few villagers were already sweeping away the remnants of last night's fete. Somewhere a crow called, sharp and lonely. Finally, she nodded. Yes. And in this village quiet is rarer than we like to believe. The clock struck 8:30. The mist began to lift, revealing the autumn colours beneath. Orange leaves, damp hedges, the faint smoke of breakfast fires rising from chimneys. Yet despite the returning warmth of day, a chill remained. Somewhere behind those tidy windows lay the reason a man had died beneath the Halloween lanterns, and Miss Marple, ever patient, meant to find it, one stitch, one observation at a time. Inspector Craddock arrived just as the church clock struck 10, his sturdy motor car rumbling down the narrow lane like an impatient thought. The morning fog had thinned, but a faint chill lingered, enough to make his breath visible as he stepped out, buttoning his coat. He paused a moment outside Miss Marple's cottage, observing the neatly trimmed rose bushes and the smoke curling from her chimney. It was hard to imagine that behind such gentle order might lie the mind that had so often solved what Scotland Yard could not. Miss Marple opened the door before he could knock, twice. "Inspector Craddock," she greeted warmly. "How very nice to see you again, though I fear the circumstances are, as usual, less than pleasant." He tipped his hat, smiling politely. "Quite right, Miss Marple. I was hoping for a quiet visit this autumn, but your village has other plans. St. Mary Mead is full of surprises," she said, ushering him in. "Do come along. You look in need of a proper cup of tea." The sitting room was as calm as ever. Lace curtains, a low fire, and the faint scent of lavender polish. Craddock removed his gloves and accepted a seat near the hearth. Miss Marple poured the tea with practised precision, the china clinking softly. "Well," he began, "we've confirmed the deceased as Leonard Pike, retired schoolmaster, lived alone. Nothing taken, no signs of struggle inside his cottage, and his pockets contained everything but a watch. Oddly enough, only one item seems to be missing from the fete grounds, a lantern." "Orange paper shaped like a pumpkin?" Miss Marple raised. "Ah, the missing lantern." "So it was not merely misplaced. That's what puzzles us," Craddock admitted. "No evidence of robbery, no motive we can see. Everyone's saying the same thing." He kept to himself, quiet, polite, not the sort to invite trouble. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, people rarely invite trouble. It tends to arrive of its own accord, especially when pride or guilt is waiting at the door." He leaned forward slightly. "You've already got a theory, haven't you?" "Not yet," she said mildly. "Only impressions. One mustn't force conclusions too early. They bruise easily, like fruit," Craddock chuckled, though his eyes remained thoughtful. "The villagers are already in a state. Half of them suspect gypsies. The other half suspect one another." "Yes," she said softly. "And in the middle of it all, a single missing lantern. Tell me, did you happen to notice the ribbon? The one found near the body. Red satin, slightly frayed, tied twice before being torn. Such details are rarely without meaning," Craddock frowned. "We assumed it came loose during the struggle." Miss Marple looked over her teacup. "Oh, but you said there were no signs of a struggle, Inspector." He gave a small sigh. "Touché, Miss Marple." "I sometimes forget how dangerous you can be with logic," she laughed lightly. "Not dangerous, merely curious. You see, lanterns are like people. Some burn brightly for all to see, while others prefer the shadows. The trick is noticing who stands in which light." Craddock made a note in his book, his skepticism softened by familiarity. "So you believe the lantern was used for something more than decoration?" "I believe," she said, setting down her cup, "that the lanterns tell us who wanted to be seen and who wished to stay hidden." For a moment, only the clock ticked. The inspector studied her, then nodded slowly. "You always manage to find meaning in the smallest things." "It's the small things that speak the loudest," she replied gently. "A missing lantern, a torn ribbon, a stranger who avoids company." "These are whispers, Inspector, and one must learn to listen," He rose to leave, slipping his gloves back on. "Well then, Miss Marple, keep your ears open. I've a feeling I'll be back before long," she smiled, walking him to the door. "I expect you will. Do take care. The truth can be rather slippery when the fog begins to lift." Outside, the mist had cleared completely, leaving the village sharp and bright under the autumn sun. As his motor car rumbled away, Miss Marple watched from the doorway, her expression serene, but her eyes alert. The lanterns, she thought, had indeed told a story last night. It was merely a matter of learning to read by their light. Chapter 2. The Vicarage Gossip Circle. By late morning, the fog had melted into a pale golden haze, and the vicarage drawing-room was already alive with voices. The Reverend's wife, Mrs. Clement, had tried, quite unsuccessfully, to insist that this was merely a small, informal gathering. But word of tea and curiosity travels faster than any invitation, and before long, half the village had found reason to drop by. The scent of sponge cake and damp wool filled the air as chairs were drawn closer, teacups refilled, and speculation began its dance. Mrs. Price Ridley was speaking first, as she often did. She perched on the edge of her seat like a bird about to take flight, her feathered hat trembling with self-importance. "I saw him, I tell you," she declared, lowering her voice for effect. A tall figure in a dark cloak right near the hedges by the cider stall, moving ever so strangely. "I said to myself at once, something wicked is afoot, Miss Hartnell." "Nonsense, dear. You see shadows everywhere. I was at the cider stall nearly all evening, and the only wicked thing there was the strength of the brew. There was no cloaked man, but I did hear raised voices just before the lanterns went out. A quarrel, clear as anything. That's what you think you heard," Mrs. Price Ridley said sharply. "At your age, one hears all manner of things that aren't there." Miss Hartnell's eyes flashed. "Better to hear imaginary quarrels than see imaginary murderers." Mrs. Clement intervened with a soothing, "Now, ladies, please," but her gentle tone was swallowed by the rising tide of talk. Someone mentioned the police questioning. Another swore she'd glimpsed footprints by the vicarage gate. And a third claimed her cat hadn't come home that night. A sure sign, she implied darkly, of evil nearby. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual armchair, a basket of soft pink wool in her lap. Her knitting needles clicked softly, steady and precise, keeping time with the chatter. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even look up often, but her ears missed nothing. "Of course," said Mrs. Price Ridley. "The man was wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Or was it no hat at all? Come to think of it, perhaps it was a woman. Yes, I'm sure of it now. A woman in a cloak. Fancy that," Miss Hartnell folded her arm. "And next you'll say she was flying on a broomstick." A burst of laughter followed, releasing a little of the tension that had been building. Mrs. Clement smiled weakly, grateful for the humour. "It's dreadful, of course," she said, "but still, poor Mr. Pike, such a quiet soul." "Quiet, yes," said Miss Weatherby from the corner, "but not friendly. Never joined in with the parish gatherings. And didn't he have visitors sometimes?" "Strangers from outside the village." "Oh, yes." Mrs. Price Ridley pounced on that eagerly. "I saw one myself last week, a man in a brown coat. Looked shifty. They were talking near the post office, and when they noticed me—" "They stopped at once," Miss Marple murmured without glancing up. "People often stop talking when they're being stared at." "Dear." A ripple of laughter went round again, though Mrs. Price Ridley's cheeks turned a shade pinker. Still, Miss Marple's tone was kind, almost apologetic, and soon the conversation rolled on. "Such dreadful times," Mrs. Clement sighed. "And to think it all happened under our lovely lanterns." "Lanterns," Miss Hartnell mused. "You know, I'm sure I saw one being carried off toward the gate after everything went quiet. Thought it was part of the clean-up, but perhaps it wasn't." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. "How interesting," she said softly. "Did you happen to see who carried it?" Miss Hartnell frowned, lost in thought. No, it was too dark. Just a shadow moving away. But I remember the light. It flickered oddly, as if something inside was damp." Mrs. Price Ridley scoffed. "Lanterns don't flicker, they glow." "You must have imagined it." Miss Marple resumed knitting. "Sometimes imagination is more reliable than memory," she murmured, almost to herself. And sometimes, when everyone remembers differently, one must wonder who remembers too clearly. Her words floated above the chatter, delicate, yet unmistakable. The room fell briefly silent before the conversation picked up again, softer this time, less certain. The ladies exchanged glances as if realizing that behind all their cheerful gossip lay something darker, a truth none of them had yet touched. By the time the gathering broke up, the air had grown heavy with tea and speculation. Coats were buttoned, hats adjusted, polite farewells exchanged. Miss Marple remained seated, finishing the last few stitches of her row. Her eyes followed the departing figures through the window, each one walking briskly home, each certain of their own version of events. When the last voice faded down the lane, she set her knitting aside and poured herself one final cup of tea. The surface rippled faintly as she stirred, lost in thought. The contradictions had been many, but somewhere among them lay the truth. People, she reflected, were like her stitches, crossed, looped, and twisted. But when you stepped back far enough, a clear pattern always emerged. The path to Mrs. Alder's cottage wound along the edge of the village, bordered by tall hedges and half-fallen leaves that whispered as Miss Marple passed. The widow's home sat slightly apart from its neighbours, a small, whitewashed place with ivy curling round the windows and a faint scent of smoke hanging in the air. It was not unfriendly, yet there was an air of solitude about it, a silence that felt deliberate, as though the house itself preferred to be left alone. Mrs. Alder answered the knock almost at once. She was a pale woman, not yet old, but worn thin by years that had been too heavy. Her apron was smudged with ash, and a wisp of hair had escaped her bun. When she saw Miss Marple, she managed a faint smile. "Miss Marple, you'll excuse the mess. I've been cleaning up after all those lanterns." "I wouldn't call it a mess at all," Miss Marple said kindly, stepping inside. The front room was modest but neat, except for a table near the hearth crowded with paper scraps, bits of ribbon and wax drippings. Several lanterns, half-finished, hung from the rafters. The morning light filtering through them painted the walls with a soft, flickering glow. "They were beautiful," Miss Marple remarked, setting down her gloves. "I do believe the fete would have been quite ordinary without them." Mrs. Alder's expression softened. "Oh, I'm glad you think so. It's become a sort of tradition, you know. My late husband started it. Every year he'd help the vicar hang the first lantern on the green. After he passed, I thought it would be wrong to let it end." Miss Marple nodded, understanding the comfort of small rituals. "And yet something went wrong this time." Mrs. Alder's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table. "Yes, such a dreadful business. Poor Mr. Pike, I can hardly bear to think of it." "I hope they find who did it." "I'm sure they will." Her tone gentle but inquisitive. "The inspector mentioned that one of your lanterns was missing. I wondered if you might recall anything about that." The widow hesitated. "Well, yes. Now that you mention it, someone did come for one earlier that day. A man, I think. Said he'd been sent by the vicar to fetch a few spares for the garden path. He seemed in rather a hurry, but I didn't think twice." "Everyone was rushing about. Do you know him?" "I don't believe so. He was polite enough, though he didn't look me in the eye much. Just took the lantern and went off." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And that was before the fete began." "Oh, hours before." "Around mid-afternoon, I'd say." Mrs. Alder looked toward the window, as if retracing the memory in her mind. "He had a brown coat, maybe? Or was it grey?" "Funny, I thought I'd remember better." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Memories are like smoke. The harder one tries to catch them, the quicker they fade." Mrs. Alder gave a weak laugh, then reached to adjust one of the hanging lanterns. The motion stirred a faint trace of soot on her sleeve, dark against the pale fabric. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to it, but said nothing. Instead, she admired the workmanship, the careful folds, the steady stitching of the paper. "They do leave a bit of soot," Mrs. Alder said quickly, brushing at the mark. "I've been burning the leftover candles to check for drips." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "Such care you take." "A pity that one went astray." The widow sighed. "I suppose it'll turn up. Perhaps it's still somewhere near the green." But her tone lacked conviction, and her gaze didn't meet Miss Marple's. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the faint ticking of a mantel clock filled the air. Then Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt.
"Thank you, Mrs. Alder. You've been most helpful."
"I dare say small details often matter more than we realize." Mrs. Alder nodded absently, her fingers still tracing the soot mark.
"I hope so, Miss Marple."
"Truly I do." Outside the air felt cooler, the light dimmer despite the afternoon hour. Miss Marple paused at the gate, glancing back through the window. Mrs. Alder stood where she'd left her, framed by the warm glow of the lanterns. The widow looked lost in thought, perhaps in memory. A widow, a lantern, and a missing hour, Miss Marple reflected as she turned away. Such small things often cast the longest shadows. Chapter 3. The Missing Hour. The village seemed quieter the next morning, as though even the sparrows were subdued by the weight of the previous night's discoveries. Inspector Craddock stood on the green, his coat collar turned up against the chill, making notes in his small black book, while the constable measured footprints near the gate. Miss Marple approached with her usual calm step, a knitting bag over one arm and an expression of mild curiosity that Craddock was beginning to recognize as something far sharper than it appeared. "Good morning, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "I do hope you've managed to get some rest." He gave a faint smile. "Rest comes later, Miss Marple. There's always one more detail waiting to trip a man up. But I'm rather hoping this one will behave itself." She looked around the square. "Murder rarely behaves itself, I find." Craddock chuckled under his breath, then closed his notebook. "You're quite right. Though in this case we may have found something that helps." Mr. Pike left the fete shortly before 9. Several villagers saw him take the path behind the cider stall, heading toward the church road. But he never reached home. Miss Marple frowned gently.
"Such a short distance."
One could hardly lose one's way, indeed. And yet something happened in those few minutes that stopped him for good. Craddock reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, cracked watch in an evidence envelope.
"This was found in his coat."
It had stopped at 9:10. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. 9:10? Curious. The church clock struck 9 at the very moment the lanterns were being lit. I remember it distinctly. The sound carried over the square. "That's what caught my attention as well," said Craddock. "Several witnesses remember the same thing. But by 9:10 Mr. Pike was already gone from sight. It's as if the village swallowed him." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Time is a strange witness, Inspector. It seldom tells the truth, it merely points to it." He gave a sceptical smile. "You mean to say a broken watch might be lying?"
"I mean," she replied gently, "that time can be manipulated."
A stopped watch, a clock wound too soon, or a bell that rings later than it ought. Such small discrepancies have solved greater mysteries. Craddock folded the envelope carefully. "Still, I prefer facts that stay put. We've searched the path from the cider stall to the church twice over.
No sign of a struggle, no footprints leading astray.
But we did find traces of wax on the grass near the gate. Lantern wax? Possibly. The constable thought it looked like candle drippings. And of course, one of the widow's lanterns is still missing." Miss Marple looked toward the green where the remnants of the fete still lingered, bits of bunting fluttering, tables half dismantled, the faint scent of cider in the air. "Lanterns and timepieces," she murmured. "One gives light, the other marks its passage. Perhaps Mr. Pike stumbled upon something or someone when both were out of alignment." Craddock studied her, amused despite himself. "You have a way of making riddles sound like reason, Miss Marple." "Oh, I assure you, Inspector."
"Reason is nothing more than a collection of small riddles."
"Properly arranged." He chuckled again, though his eyes were serious. "Mr. Pike wasn't well known, was he?"
"Moved here just 6 months ago." "Quite right."
"A retired schoolteacher, I believe. Lived alone in the cottage beyond the meadows. Kept to himself, but always polite. One of those men who prefer books to people. Did he have enemies?"
"I can't imagine anyone disliking him enough to wish him dead."
"But, as I once heard a rather cynical colonel say, people rarely kill those they hate. They kill those who inconvenience them." Craddock closed his notebook once more.
"Inconvenient, eh?"
"Then perhaps we should find out who he might have inconvenienced." Miss Marple smiled faintly.
"A sensible approach, Inspector."
"Though I suspect your missing hour may tell you more than any neighbour could." As she turned to leave, Craddock called after her. "You think the missing hour matters more than who killed him?" "Oh, no," she said, looking back with that mild, knowing expression he'd come to respect. "It's the same question, merely told twice. One in action, the other in time." When she was gone, Craddock stood for a long moment on the green, listening to the distant ticking of the church clock.
9:10. A stopped watch, a vanished man, a single lantern unaccounted for.
He rubbed his chin and muttered, "In murder, time seldom tells the truth, it merely points to it." And as the wind shifted through the hedges, the faint scent of wax and smoke drifted again through the air, as if to agree. Fog had settled thickly over St. Mary Mead by the next morning, the kind that softens every outline and makes familiar things appear strangely uncertain. The air was damp with the scent of earth and wood smoke, and the sound of distant church bells carried like a faint memory through the mist. Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible grey coat and her warmest shawl, took her walking stick and set out toward the vicarage. She told herself it was only for a bit of morning air, but in truth she was thinking of Mr. Pike's last steps, where they might have faltered, and why. The vicarage garden sloped gently down toward the church road, its hedges tall and neatly clipped, though now beaded with moisture. Miss Marple had always admired the vicar's gardener for keeping order, but this morning she was grateful for his precision. The soft ground still held impressions from the fete. Children's shoes, ladies' heels, a few cart tracks, but further along, near the back hedge where the path narrowed, something caught her eye. There were footprints, faint but distinct, pressed into the damp soil. One set larger, the other noticeably smaller. She crouched, with a quiet murmur of effort, touching the edge of a print with her gloved hand. The larger set moved steadily forward toward the road. The smaller set followed for several paces, then turned back abruptly. "Curious," she whispered. Someone changed their mind rather suddenly. From the gate behind her came the soft creak of hinges. The vicar himself emerged, carrying a bundle of letters.
"Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. Nearly gave me a fright." She smiled up at him, straightening. "Good morning, Mr. Clement. I'm merely admiring your hedge," he chuckled.
"You're the first person to call it admirable, I assure you, though I fear it's overdue for a trim." Miss Marple nodded vaguely, her eyes still on the ground. "You've not noticed any trampled paths nearby, have you?"
"Perhaps visitors during the night."
The vicar blinked.
"Goodness, no."
"Though I heard the constable was about early, asking questions. Terrible business about that poor man."
"They say he died near the church lane, don't they?"
"Yes," she said softly, "though I wonder if he was alone when he set out." The vicar frowned. "What do you mean?" "These prints," she said, gesturing with her stick. "They go together until here, then one set turns back, rather hurriedly, I'd say. Notice the deeper heel marks. Someone followed Mr. Pike and then thought better of it." He peered closer, adjusting his spectacles.
"By Jove, you're right."
"But why would anyone follow him?" "There are many reasons people follow others," Miss Marple murmured. "La hate or fear."
"Only one of those leads to murder." The vicar was silent for a moment, then sighed.
"It all sounds so dreadful, Miss Marple."
"I can't imagine anyone here capable of it. Nor can most murderers until the moment arrives," she said gently. She stepped back,
studying the way the smaller footprints seemed to overlap the larger ones at one point.
"It wasn't a child," she went on thoughtfully.
"Too purposeful. And the stride, yes, someone of moderate height."
"Perhaps a woman in sensible shoes." The vicar looked uneasy. "You're not suggesting—" "Oh, I suggest nothing," Miss Marple interrupted. "I simply observe."
"Still, it does make one wonder if Mr. Pike carried something worth following for." She looked around at the fog curling over the grass, at the church tower barely visible beyond the trees. The village seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere, a milk cart rattled by on the cobblestones, and the faint sound of a dog barking broke the hush. "Inspector Craddock mentioned nothing about theft," said the vicar. "No," Miss Marple replied, "which is precisely why I think there was something taken, something small enough to pass unnoticed, yet important enough to kill for." As they stood there, a sudden gust of wind parted the mist just enough to reveal the outline of the church gate in the distance, the direction the larger prints had gone. Miss Marple watched as the fog slowly closed again as if the village were concealing its own secret. She turned toward the vicar with a mild smile. "I believe I shall have a word with Inspector Craddock. He may find these prints of interest." He nodded, visibly relieved to hand the matter to someone else. Yes, of course. Though I do hope it's all just a misunderstanding." Miss Marple tucked her hand through the crook of her stick. "So do I, Mr. Clement, but in my experience, when a person turns back too quickly, it's seldom for an innocent reason." And with that, she walked slowly into the fog, the echo of her footsteps merging with the unseen rhythm of another pair from the night before, one that had turned back too soon and another that never returned at all. Chapter 4. The Schoolhouse. Secret. Inspector Craddock stood in the little sitting-room of Miss Marple's cottage, the morning light slanting through lace curtains. The kettle hummed softly in the background, and the faint aroma of toast and marmalade mingled with the scent of damp earth from the garden. He held a worn envelope in his gloved hand, its edges creased from years of folding and unfolding. Across the front, in faded ink, was the name Leonard Pike. He set it on the table with care. "We found this in his coat pocket, Miss Marple."
Thought it was just a bill at first, but it isn't. She looked up from her knitting, eyes bright behind her spectacles.
"Oh!" Craddock opened the envelope and drew out a letter, 2 pages, written in a hurried, slanted hand. "It's a demand."
Money to be mentions an old mistake and something about keeping quiet for everyone's
sake. Signed only with an initial R. It
appears Mr. Pike was being blackmailed. Miss
Marple's needles paused mid-stitch.
How very sad.
I had thought he carried a burden of some kind. One often senses these things. "Yes, well," Craddock continued, "I did a bit of digging. Pike wasn't just a schoolteacher. He taught for nearly 20 years at a boarding school in Sussex. St. Edmund's, ever heard of it?" Miss Marple nodded faintly. "A respectable place, if I recall. But I do remember a rather unfortunate story some years ago. A scandal involving one of the boys." "Exactly," Craddock said grimly. "A theft among the upper forms, money gone missing, a promising young lad accused, and Pike caught in the middle. Officially, the matter was hushed up, but he resigned not long after. The boy's father was someone influential, Colonel Hargreaves. He made sure Pike never taught again." Miss Marple sighed, her expression wistful. "A teacher's reputation is as fragile as a spun thread. Once it's broken, it cannot be mended," Craddock nodded. "We think whoever wrote this letter knew about the scandal. Maybe one of the villagers, someone who recognized him and saw an opportunity." She reached for the letter delicately, reading the faded words. "The tone suggests desperation more than malice. Whoever wrote it felt cornered, not cruel." He frowned. "You think the blackmailer was frightened?" "Perhaps," she replied softly. "Fear drives people to strange extremes. But you see, Inspector, there's something else. Mr. Pike received this letter recently. Why keep it in his coat rather than destroy it?"
"Unless he meant to confront the sender." Craddock rubbed the back of his neck.
"So you're saying he went to the fete expecting a meeting?" "I would think so. The timing fits perfectly. An evening when half the village was about, and shadows were plentiful. It's an excellent time to meet someone without being noticed." Craddock moved to the window, staring out at the quiet lane. "If Pike meant to pay off his blackmailer, it didn't go as planned." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Money rarely solves matters of guilt. It merely postpones them." She set her knitting aside and leaned forward slightly.
"Tell me, Inspector, did the letter mention how much was demanded?"
£20, he said.
"Hardly a fortune. That confirms it then," she said softly.
"It wasn't greed. It was fear. Fear of exposure, perhaps even shame. Someone who valued secrecy more than money." Craddock frowned again. "But why kill him?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, the kind of smile that always made Craddock uneasy. "Because secrets, like debts, have a way of growing heavier over time. When a man like Mr. Pike returns to a quiet village, hoping to begin anew, he forgets that the past has feet, and it follows." He gave a long, low whistle. "Even the most peaceful villages can't keep the past buried forever." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "And in a place like St. Mary Mead, the past never truly buries itself. It simply waits until someone stumbles upon it again, under a lantern's glow perhaps." She looked toward the window, where the fog was beginning to lift. Somewhere beyond the hedge, a bell chimed the quarter hour.
"Tell me, Inspector," she asked quietly, "who among our good villagers once lived near Sussex?"
Craddock turned sharply. "You think the letter came from someone here?" "Oh, I should be very surprised if it didn't," she said. "People imagine villages are small, closed little worlds, but they are full of wanderers, returning souls, and hidden connections. I should start with anyone who shows too much sympathy for the dead man, or too little." Craddock slipped the letter back into its envelope. "You make it sound so simple." Miss Marple smiled again, picking up her knitting. "Human nature is never simple, Inspector."
"Only predictable." And as he stepped out into the sunlight, Craddock couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet cottage behind him held more truth than his entire police file.
Somewhere between the ink on that letter and the shadows of the fete, the past had reached out its hand and claimed Leonard Pike once more. The church bazaar was in full swing that afternoon. The village green transformed once again with bunting, jam stalls, and tables stacked high with knitted scarves and spiced cakes. The scent of cinnamon and damp leaves filled the air, while laughter rippled through the fog-thinned sunlight. To a casual observer, St. Mary Mead seemed restored to its cheerful self, as though tragedy had been tidily folded away like yesterday's news. But Miss Marple knew better. Grief in a small village never vanished. It simply changed its clothes. She moved slowly through the crowd, pausing to admire a tray of currant scones and to exchange greetings with Mrs. Price Ridley, who was holding court near the raffle table. Her knitting bag hung lightly from her wrist, her blue eyes calm and attentive. Beneath her gentle manner, her mind was busy observing how people spoke, how they looked away, how they smiled too quickly or not at all. Children ran between the stalls with the careless joy only the young can afford. One of them, a little girl in a wool hat far too large for her head, carried a lantern on a string. The light inside flickered warmly, casting soft ripples on her mittened hands. It was a lovely thing, simple but elegant, made from parchment panels painted with autumn leaves. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it a moment, admiration giving way to something keener. That design, those leaves, that precise trimming of golden braid, was unmistakable. It was identical to the missing lantern from the fete. She turned slightly, her eyes scanning the faces around her. And there, by the cake stall, stood Mrs. Alder, the widow who had crafted the lanterns. Her gloved hand hovered mid-air, a slice of sponge halfway to her plate. The moment she saw the child's lantern, her smile faltered. Her entire expression, so carefully composed all morning, flickered like a candle in a draught. Miss Marple caught the movement, a quick intake of breath, a tightening at the corner of the mouth, the brief downward glance that always betrayed guilt or fear. It wasn't outrage or indignation that crossed Mrs. Alder's face. It was recognition. "Mrs. Alder," Miss Marple said kindly as she approached, "how delightful to see you out."
"I was so pleased to hear your lanterns were the pride of the fete." Mrs. Alder set down her plate too quickly, crumbs scattering. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes."
Such a pity about poor Mr. Pike, wasn't it? Terrible, terrible thing. Her words rushed together, as though spoken to fill silence rather than to communicate. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Quite dreadful, though one does take small comfort in seeing your handiwork admired again." She nodded toward the child with the lantern. Mrs. Alder's eyes followed, and for a moment her composure cracked entirely.
I don't know where she got that," she said too quickly. "Surely it's one of the spares?"
Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone as gentle as ever. "Though I thought you'd mention the missing one was taken just before the fete by someone in a hurry." A flush rose in Mrs. Alder's cheeks. "Did I say that?"
"Oh, well, one hardly keeps track."
There was such confusion that evening. She turned her attention to the cakes, hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple regarded her with quiet sympathy.
Of course.
Confusion does make it difficult to remember details. For a long moment neither woman spoke. The laughter of children echoed faintly across the green, mingling with the vicar's voice announcing winners at the tombola. Then Mrs. Alder said softly, "It's dreadful, Miss Marple. People talk, but they don't understand.
I only wanted to help. He didn't deserve it, but I never meant... She stopped abruptly, biting her lip. Miss Marple said nothing.
She merely rested a hand on the edge of the table, her expression patient, kind. Secrets, my dear, she murmured after a pause, have a curious way of slipping out, especially when lanterns are involved. Mrs. Alder's eyes filled briefly with tears before she turned away, busying herself with arranging pastries that didn't need arranging. As Miss Marple walked on, she felt the faintest chill trace her spine. Not from the weather, it was warmer now, but from the certainty that she had seen something vital. Some faces, she reflected, light up with guilt faster than any lantern. Chapter 5. A Visit After Dark. The evening mist had thickened into a soft, rolling fog by the time Miss Marple reached the far edge of the village. Lamps glowed faintly behind curtained windows, and the air smelled of smoke and damp leaves. It was the sort of night when sound carried oddly. Each footstep seemed to echo. Each rustle from the hedgerow felt a little too near. Mrs. Alder's cottage stood alone at the bend of the lane, half covered in ivy and still lit by a single oil lamp in the front room. Miss Marple hesitated at the gate, listening. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and the church clock began to strike 7. She pushed the gate open with a soft creak and made her way up the narrow path. Before she could knock, the door opened. Mrs. Alder stood there, pale and startled, her eyes rimmed red. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice uneven.
You shouldn't have come all this way in the fog." "Nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple replied warmly, stepping inside.
"I always find evening air rather refreshing. Besides, I thought we might finish our conversation from this afternoon. The one about the lantern." The widow hesitated, then stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The sitting room was small but tidy, with a faint scent of lavender and soot. A single framed photograph sat on the mantel, a young man in uniform smiling faintly, his cap tucked beneath one arm. Miss Marple looked at it with quiet respect. "Your husband?" she asked softly. Mrs. Alder nodded, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron.
"Yes, George, he died during the war. I never quite stopped talking to him, understand."
"When one has lost someone dear, silence can be the hardest companion." Mrs. Alder sank into a chair by the fire. "You always sound so calm, Miss Marple."
"As if you already know what people are about to say." "I assure you," said Miss Marple, settling opposite her. "I'm often surprised."
"Though tonight I have a feeling you've been carrying a story for quite some time." The widow's gaze dropped to the flickering firelight. For a while she said nothing. Then very quietly she began. "It wasn't me he wanted to hurt, you know. It was George, Mr. Pike. He was a teacher before he came here. He taught at the school where George worked as groundskeeper. They were friendly once."
"George admired him." Miss Marple listened without interruption. "But then," Mrs. Alder went on,
her voice trembling, "something was stolen, a silver cup belonging to one of the houses. Mr. Pike accused George. Said he'd seen him near the master's office that night. It wasn't true, George swore it. But no one believed him. He lost his job and, well, pride is a cruel thing, Miss Marple. It eats a man alive." The clock on the mantel ticked softly between her words. "When George died," she continued, "I thought it was over. I came here to forget, to start again. But then Mr. Pike arrived in the spring. He didn't recognize me at first. When he did, he came to my door one evening, said he regretted the past, but his eyes were cold. He said he'd found something. Proof, he called it. He wanted to make it right, but I knew what he meant. He wanted to talk, to confess, to bring it all up again." Miss Marple's expression was unreadable, but her tone remained soft.
"And you couldn't let him?"
Mrs. Alder shook her head, tears bright in her eyes. "I'd spent years building a life when no one knew what George was accused of. If people heard, if the story came back, it would have destroyed everything.
I begged him to stay quiet."
"But he said the truth had waited long enough." "Truth is rather patient," Miss Marple murmured. "It always finds its moment." The widow pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "That night at the fete he came to the lantern stall. He said we'd talk after the lighting.
I saw him leave just before 9.
I followed him down the path.
I only meant to reason with him, to beg him again.
But he turned. He was angry, and I—" She broke off, sobbing quietly. Miss Marple rose and went to her, resting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Hush now, my dear."
"I understand. I didn't mean to hurt him," Mrs. Alder whispered.
He stumbled. There was the lantern, the candle. I tried to help, but it all happened so fast. When the flame caught, I panicked.
I ran. Miss Marple's eyes were sorrowful but steady.
A secret thought buried with a husband can rise again, especially on Halloween, she said quietly. The night has a way of stirring ghosts, whether of the heart or the past. Mrs. Alder looked up, her face pale in the lamplight. "What will happen now?" "That," Miss Marple said gently, "is for the inspector to decide. But I dare say he'll understand more than most. The law must do its duty, but mercy has its own form of justice." Outside, the fog pressed softly against the windows, the world dim and hushed, as though the village itself were listening. And in that fragile silence, two women sat together, one confessing, one forgiving, while the lantern flame on the hearth guttered low, finally at peace. Morning light crept cautiously through the fog, turning the village green into a pale watercolour of shapes and shadows. The fate bunting still hung limp between the trees, damp from the night air. Miss Marple stood near the church gate, her gloved hands folded neatly around her umbrella, her eyes fixed on a small bundle of evidence Inspector Craddock had brought along in a paper envelope. "It was caught on a bramble near the hedge," he said, frowning.
"A torn ribbon."
"Seems to have been tied to one of the lanterns, but I'm not certain which." "Likely the missing one." Miss Marple took the ribbon delicately between her fingers. It was a fine satin, slightly scorched at one end, with a faint scent of beeswax and smoke. A small fray at the edge suggested it had been torn in haste. She turned it over thoughtfully. "A lovely shade," she murmured. "Copper red, quite unusual." "Unusual enough to matter?" Craddock asked. She smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, in a village like this, everything matters, especially when it shouldn't." They walked together along the path toward the vicarage hedge, where the ribbon had been found. The grass was heavy with dew, and each step released the soft scent of earth. Craddock paused to light a cigarette, his tone respectful, but weary. "I've questioned everyone who left the fete early. No one saw Pike after 9. The only clue is that he was carrying something, a parcel, perhaps." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes, he was carrying truth, Inspector."
"And truth can be the heaviest burden of all," he raised it.
"You think the widow, Mrs. Alder, knew what he carried?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She simply looked again at the ribbon in her hand, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I think Mrs. Alder has had her share of burdens," she said at last. "Grief can make one careful, and secrecy even more so." Craddock studied her face for a moment. "You've spoken to her?" "I have," Miss Marple said gently. "A very sad woman. But sadness, you know, often leaves little marks, threads of it here and there." She brushed the ribbon softly against her palm. "And sometimes those threads are more literal than one expects." He glanced at her sharply.
"You mean this?"
Miss Marple only smiled again, the faintest quirk of amusement in her eyes. "I mean, Inspector, that I've seen this sort of ribbon before."
"It's a particular make, not sold in the village shops. One must order it, or have it in one's own sewing kit." Craddock blew out a slow stream of smoke. "And who would that be?"
"Mrs. Alder, for one," said Miss Marple lightly. "She embroiders the altar cloths, uses fine threads and trims."
"I've admired her handiwork at the church more than once." He turned to look at her fully. "You're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing," she interrupted.
"Only observing," the inspector sighed. "You have a way of saying nothing that says everything, Miss Marple." She gave a polite laugh.
"It's a habit of age.
When one has spent a lifetime listening to chatter, one learns the value of silence." They continued walking until the path curved back toward the square. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward Mrs. Alder's cottage in the distance, its windows shuttered, chimney smoking faintly. She felt a pang, not of suspicion but of sorrow. The truth sat quietly in her mind, as steady as her heartbeat. She folded the ribbon carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, then handed it to Craddock. "Keep this safe, Inspector," she said softly. "It may not scream its secret, but in silence the truth often whispers loudest." Craddock nodded, pocketing the envelope. "You're quite sure of your whisper, then?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied, her voice as calm as ever.
"Not quite sure."
"But I've found it best to let people hear their own truths in their own time." As they parted at the gate, the church bells began to chime the quarter hour. Miss Marple paused, listening to their distant music fade into the fog. The ribbon's colour, copper red like fading embers, seemed to glow faintly in her mind. She turned toward home, her thoughts gentle but sharp, each step measured, each detail stored away. For in her experience, the smallest, quietest things often solve the loudest mysteries. Chapter 6. The Village Meeting. The village hall smelled faintly of damp wood and strong tea, the sort that had been steeping too long. A thin fog pressed at the windows, blurring the lamps outside into soft golden halos. Inspector Craddock stood at the front, his notes spread before him on the table. Around him, the villagers shifted and murmured, faces familiar, nervous, too eager to appear unconcerned. Miss Marple sat near the back, her knitting bag resting neatly by her feet, the needles still for once. "Thank you all for coming," Craddock began, clearing his throat. "I realize this is unpleasant business, but we must review last night's fate, specifically the hours between 8 and 10. Mrs. Price Ridley, ever brisk, spoke first.
"I told you already, Inspector. I left before the dancing began."
The air was quite chill, and I'm not as young as I was. From the corner, Colonel Bantry gave a discreet cough. "You seemed lively enough during the apple bobbing, my dear." A ripple of restrained laughter softened the tension, but Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Price Ridley's hand tightened around her handbag. A woman defensive before being accused was rarely at ease with her conscience. Craddock nodded politely. "And you, Miss Hartnell? You claim to hear raised voices near the cider stall?"
"I did indeed," Miss Hartnell declared, her chin lifting.
A man's voice, sharp, commanding.
"And another frightened, I'd say."
Though it was dark and the lanterns gave strange shadows, did you recognize either voice? "No, Inspector. But I saw a figure walking toward the lane, a man with a hat."
"Or possibly a woman with a large scarf." At that, Miss Marple's lips twitched, the faintest ghost of amusement.
In St. Mary Mead, one person's memory was rarely the same as another's. The truth, she often said, preferred to hide between them. Craddock continued. "Mr. Weatherby, you were on the committee for the fete. Did you notice Mr. Pike after 9? The grocer fidgeted."
"Can't say I did."
"I was helping stack chairs. But I did see Mrs. Alder near the stalls earlier. She seemed upset. Something about a missing lantern." At the mention of the widow's name, the room grew still. Mrs. Alder sat near the door, her eyes fixed on the floor, hands folded tightly in her lap. The firelight flickered across her pale face, and Miss Marple noticed again that strange mixture of sorrow and resolve, a woman who had spent too long defending herself against the world. Craddock addressed her gently. "Mrs. Alder, would you tell us again about your last sighting of Mr. Pike?" Her voice came quiet, yet steady. "He came to me about the lanterns. Said one was missing and asked if I'd lent it. I told him I thought someone had borrowed it earlier. That's all, Inspector." "Did he say why he was concerned?" A brief hesitation, then, "No, only that he'd seen something that troubled him." In the hush that followed, the hall clock ticked like a metronome of unease. Miss Marple's eyes, calm and bright, drifted from face to face. Mrs. Price Ridley's lips pressed tight. Miss Hartnell avoided everyone's gaze. The grocer stared into his hat, and Mrs. Alder's fingers trembled ever so slightly as she smoothed the edge of her shawl. Craddock folded his notes. "Very well. If anyone remembers anything else, anything at all, please come forward after the meeting." As chairs scraped and people murmured their good nights, Miss Marple remained seated. Her gaze lingered on the group dispersing into the fog. There was talk, laughter, even a few forced jokes. But beneath it all lay that faint scent of fear, the kind that clings not to the guilty, but to those who know more than they wish to admit. Craddock joined her at the back. "Not much help, was it?" he muttered. Miss Marple smiled softly.
On the contrary, Inspector.
People reveal the most when they believe they've said nothing at all. He frowned. You think one of them's lying? Oh, not lying, she said kindly, merely remembering too quickly. When the innocent defend themselves before being questioned, one must wonder what they fear. Outside, the fog wrapped the hall in quiet secrecy. Miss Marple gathered her things, her eyes thoughtful. The night seemed to hum with possibilities, and she knew, quite calmly, that the truth was sitting among them still, waiting to be noticed. The murmur of voices had only just begun to fade when Mrs. Alder rose from her chair. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though each breath cost her a measure of courage. The villagers turned toward her, surprised by her sudden resolve. Miss Marple, who had been gathering her knitting, paused mid-motion, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Inspector Craddock," Mrs. Alder said, her tone faint but steady. "There is something I must tell you." About Mr. Pike, every whisper in the hall stilled. Even the fire in the grate seemed to quiet its crackle. Craddock straightened, his pen poised above his notebook. "Go on, Mrs. Alder." She took a trembling step forward. The lantern light caught her face, pale beneath her black veil.
I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she said.
He came to me last night, angry.
He wanted something back.
Something that belonged to him. Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. The widow's voice carried the weight of exhaustion, the kind that came not from guilt alone, but from years of holding back the truth. "And what was that, Mrs. Alder?" Craddock asked quietly. She reached into her shawl and drew out a lantern, dented, soot-stained, but unmistakably one of her own. A small gasp rippled through the hall.
"This," she said.
"He left it with me."
"Years ago?" Craddock's eyes widened.
"That's the missing lantern?" Before she could answer, a tremor ran through her. The lantern slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, its small glass pane cracking with a soft, pitiful sound. Mrs. Alder swayed once, then crumpled as though the air itself had abandoned her. "Good heavens!" cried Mrs. Price Ridley, rising from her chair. Craddock was already beside her, calling for water, his hand checking for a pulse. "She's fainted," he said sharply.
"Someone fetch the doctor." But Miss Marple was not looking at the widow.
Her gaze had fallen to the fallen lantern, where a faint glint of white could be seen inside the broken pane. She stooped, calm as ever, and gently lifted the object. Inside, tightly folded, was a small envelope, its paper yellowed, the ink smudged with time. On the front, written in careful hand, were 2 words, "For Leonard Pike." Craddock looked over her shoulder. "What on earth?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She turned the letter over, studying its edges, then glanced toward the unconscious woman. "It seems," she said softly, "that Mr. Pike left behind more than memory. He left his past neatly sealed in a lantern." The doctor arrived breathless and knelt beside Mrs. Alder. "A fainting spell," he murmured, checking her pulse, brought on by shock most likely. "Best get her home." As the villagers gathered their coats and whispered their theories, Miss Marple stood very still, the letter still in her hand. Craddock watched her, brow furrowed.
"You think it's connected to his death?"
"I think," she said, folding the letter once more and handing it to him, "that the dead man's secret has returned to light, but not yet the truth." Craddock pocketed the envelope carefully. "You always have a way of making the simple sound complicated, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly.
"Not complicated, Inspector. Only unfinished." They watched as Mrs. Alder was carried out, her shawl trailing like a dark ribbon behind her.
The lantern lay forgotten on the table, its broken glass catching the light one last time before the fire dimmed. Outside, the fog had thickened, softening the sound of footsteps and closing in around the hall like a curtain. Miss Marple lingered at the doorway, her face thoughtful. She had seen enough of human nature to know that confessions often arrived too late, and that truth, once hidden, rarely surfaced without consequence. As the door closed behind her, she glanced once more at the fading lantern glow. It flickered weakly, as if reluctant to die out completely, holding within it the faint, stubborn pulse of a secret not yet told. Chapter 7. The Letter's Contents. Inspector Craddock unfolded the letter with deliberate care, the paper soft from age and creased from long concealment. The ink had bled faintly at the edges, but the writing, neat, almost schoolmasterly, remained clear. Miss Marple sat opposite him in the vicarage sitting-room, her knitting resting in her lap, though her hands had been still for some time. The fire crackled quietly between them, its glow gentle and unwavering. Craddock began to read aloud, his voice low. "My dear Mrs. Alder, you will not like what I have to say, but I have no choice. The matter of your late husband's papers must come to light unless you are prepared to make things right. I'm not a cruel man, but I will not be made a fool of again. You know what was forged, and you know what it cost me.
I ask only for what is fair, a sum to settle the harm done, and my word that no one else shall ever know. L. Pike." He lowered the page slowly.
"So," he said, "blackmail. Plain as daylight." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. Mr. Pike was always a man of rules, Inspector, a teacher to the end. He likely thought he was correcting a wrong, but such corrections often right themselves in tragedy. Craddock frowned.
Her husband forged documents, you think?"
"Quite possibly," said Miss Marple. "Perhaps something harmless once, but dangerous in memory. A small deceit that grew heavy over the years. People forget that guilt doesn't fade, it deepens." Craddock read the letter again, this time noticing faint marks along the edge, creases that didn't match the fold. "You said this was found inside the lantern. But if Mrs. Alder was being blackmailed, why would she hide the letter instead of burning it?" Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Because, Inspector, she never saw it." He looked up.
"Never saw it?"
She leaned forward slightly, voice gentle but firm. "Consider, Mr. Pike intended to send it, but perhaps he never had the chance.
Someone else intercepted it."
Someone who feared what might happen if the widow received such a letter." Craddock rubbed his temple.
"You mean someone stole it before it reached her and killed him to keep it hidden?"
Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A blackmailer rarely dies by accident, nor by the hand he threatened." For a moment, the room fell into the kind of silence that feels almost alive. The rain had begun again, soft and persistent, whispering against the window panes. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice, before stilling again. "Do you believe Mrs. Alder is innocent, then?" Craddock asked. "I believe she is weary," Miss Marple said simply. "Weary souls don't strike out, they surrender."
"No, Inspector."
The person who killed Mr. Pike was not protecting themselves, but someone else. Someone who believed they were saving a friend or preserving a reputation. He looked up sharply. "One of the villagers?" "Of course," she said softly. "The outside world never murders for small village sins."
"Only neighbours do that." Craddock stood, pacing before the fire.
"And the lantern? Why hide the letter inside it?" "Because the killer panicked," Miss Marple replied. "They thought to destroy it, but feared the light. So they did the next best thing, they hid it in something meant to shine." Craddock stopped pacing, turning to her with a frown of admiration. "You make it sound poetic." She smiled again, eyes kind. "Murder often is, in its own dreadful way. People act from love, shame, fear, all the great forces that write poetry."
"Only, in this case, it's written in ink and soot instead of word." The inspector folded the letter and placed it carefully into his case.
"Then whoever killed Pike must have known both him and the Alders, someone who remembered the scandal even after all these years." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze distant. "Memory, Inspector, is a most dangerous companion. It keeps old wrongs alive long after forgiveness has died." Outside the rain eased, and the church bell tolled the hour. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her cardigan. "If I were you, I'd visit the vicarage again," she said softly. "There's one person there who always notices more than she should, and less than she admits." Craddock blinked. "The vicar's wife?" Miss Marple gave him a gentle, knowing smile. "No, dear. The maid." Miss Marple sat by her window that evening, the fog having folded itself once more around St. Mary Mead like an old shawl. The street lamps glowed faintly, their light smudged by the mist. In her small parlour, a single lamp burned beside her, casting its reflection in the teapot's polished lid. She had finished her supper an hour ago, but her mind had not yet settled. Certain details refused to rest, circling her thoughts as quietly as the clock's ticking. The soot, the lantern, The missing hour. She reached for her notebook, though she seldom needed it. Memory served her far better than ink. She began to murmur to herself in the gentle rhythm of one accustomed to solitude. Soot on Mrs. Alder's sleeve. A missing lantern later found with a letter inside. Mr. Pike's watch stopped at 9:10. She paused, her head tilting slightly. 9:10, the same moment the lanterns were lit. Her eyes brightened, as though a faint spark had kindled behind them.
"Oh," she whispered, "not to light the path, but to signal someone." She rose and walked to the window, peering into the still fog.
Beyond the gate, the faint outline of the vicarage hedge was just visible under the dim glow. A signal could have been seen from there, she thought, if one knew to look for it.
And who would have known?
Only someone who had helped hang the lanterns in the first place. She thought of the Fate Committee, Mr. Weatherby, Miss Hartnell, Mrs. Alder, the vicar's maid, young Tom Lister, who handled the candles. All familiar faces, all comfortably ordinary. But comfort, Miss Marple knew, was the favourite disguise of guilt. She sat again, folding her hands in her lap. If the lantern was meant to signal, she mused softly, then Pike must have expected an answer. And when he didn't receive it, he went to find the person who'd failed to meet him. Her thoughts drifted to the letter, its calm and measured cruelty. Pike had demanded money from Mrs. Alder, but perhaps he had written another to someone else, someone complicit in the old scandal. Blackmailers rarely confine themselves to a single target. Greed, like gossip, spreads quickly once it begins. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the firelight softening the sharp lines of her face. "Yes," she said quietly. There were two secrets that night.
One meant to stay hidden, and one desperate to be seen. She closed her eyes for a moment, replaying the details as if she were listening to a tune.
The lanterns being lit at 9. Pike's body found near the hedge. The footprints, 2 sets, one smaller, turning back abruptly. The soot on Mrs. Alder's sleeve, and her fear not of guilt, but of discovery. Then came the image that settled it. The broken ribbon, copper red, matching her sewing kit. But the soot, she realized, had not come from her hearth. It had come from the lantern itself, freshly lit that night. Not in her hands, but another's. Someone had borrowed her craft to hide their intent. Murderers often plan with logic, Miss Marple said softly, yet it's their emotion that betrays them. She imagined it then, the lantern glowing faintly by the hedge, a signal of meeting or of warning. Pike waiting, impatient, thinking his silence would buy him safety. And then, the smaller footprints approaching, the flicker of hesitation, the blow struck in haste and fear. Miss Marple sighed, her eyes distant. Fear was the truest motive of all. It clouded judgment and sharpened impulse. Whoever had killed Pike had done so not from greed or hatred, but from the desperate instinct to protect someone they loved. The clock chimed the half-hour. Miss Marple rose, turning down the lamp. Her thoughts were calm now, her mind neatly ordered. "There's very little mystery in evil," she murmured as she closed the curtains. "Only the sadness of what people choose to do when they're afraid." The village outside was quiet again, the fog thick and comforting. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, the pieces all now in place. Morning would bring answers, but tonight the truth already sat quietly beside her. Chapter 8. The Revelation. The next morning dawned pale and heavy with mist, the kind that seemed to hang low enough to touch. St. Mary Mead awoke slowly, as though unsure it wished to face the light. At the vicarage, the drawing-room had been prepared with quiet urgency. Chairs gathered, the fire stoked to life, tea steaming faintly on the table. It was not a formal meeting, but everyone understood its weight. Inspector Craddock stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back. His usual brisk confidence seemed subdued, tempered by the strange melancholy that lingered over the village since Pike's death. Mrs. Alder sat near the fire, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Her son Tom stood behind her, stiff, pale, eyes fixed on the rug. The vicar and Miss Hartnell whispered in a corner. while Mr. Weatherby cleared his throat every few minutes, as if to remind everyone he was still there. And then Miss Marple entered, calm and neat as ever, her soft grey cardigan buttoned to the throat. She greeted everyone kindly, as though she had simply come to offer tea and comfort, not to untangle the truth that had troubled them all. "Thank you for coming," she began gently, taking her seat by the hearth.
"I know these gatherings are unpleasant things, but I do think for everyone's sake we ought to set matters straight." Mrs. Alder's hand trembled slightly in her lap. "If it must be said, Miss Marple, then say it. I've no wish to drag things on, Miss Marple. I quite understand, my dear. And I'll be as brief as possible." She looked around the room, her eyes resting on each face in turn.
It began, of course, with Mr. Pike's letter, the one found inside the missing lantern. He had intended to use that letter to demand money from Mrs. Alder, to keep quiet about her late husband's forgery.
He had been
rather cruel in his wording. A murmur passed through the room. Miss Hartnell tutted softly. The vicar shook his head. But Mr. Pike, Miss Marple continued, was not killed by the person he sought to blackmail. He was killed by someone who thought he was saving her. She turned her gaze toward Tom. The boy's head snapped up, his lips parting in silent protest.
His mother caught his sleeve instinctively. "No," Mrs. Alder whispered, her voice breaking. "No, Miss Marple, you mustn't. He didn't." Miss Marple's expression was kind, but steady. "My dear, please."
"The truth will hurt less than the weight of silence. You've carried enough of that already." The room fell utterly still. Even the fire seemed to hush. "Tom," Miss Marple said softly, "you were near the green that evening, weren't you? You'd gone to help light the lanterns." He nodded faintly.
I had to make sure they didn't tip over. Mrs. Alder said the ribbons were delicate." "Yes, Miss Marple."
"And that's when you overheard Mr. Pike and your mother arguing near the hedge."
"You saw him raise his hand to."
"You thought, quite understandably, that he meant her harm."
"And in that moment you acted out of love?" The boy's lips trembled. He fell. I didn't mean to, I swear it."
He just wouldn't stop shouting at her.
"I thought if I pushed him away." Mrs. Alder covered her face with both hands, weeping silent. Inspector Craddock shifted uncomfortably but said nothing.
"He too had a son," Miss Marple continued gently. "When you saw what had happened, you panicked. You took the letter from his hand, and you hid it inside one of the lanterns, your mother's lantern, the one you'd made together. You tore off the ribbon to make it fit. Later, when it was found near your home, the soot gave you away." Tom looked up, eyes wide with disbelief that she knew so much. "But I didn't tell anyone. How could you?" "Because, dear," Miss Marple said, smiling sadly, "some faces light up with guilt faster than any lantern, and yours, though honest, carries the kind of sorrow that doesn't belong to youth." The vicar crossed himself quietly. Mrs. Alder reached out, clutching her son's hand. "I was going to tell," she whispered. "I couldn't bear it any longer. But before I could speak last night, I fainted."
"Oh, Miss Marple, if only I'd had the courage sooner." Miss Marple reached over and laid a comforting hand.
"There's courage in love, Mrs. Alder, and more decency in confession than most crimes ever see. You protected your son as any mother would."
"But truth, once hidden, always finds a way to glow through the cracks." The inspector cleared his throat softly.
"The law will be lenient, I think," he said, his voice quiet. "It was an accident and done in fear." "That will matter?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, indeed. But I think the punishment has already been paid. In worry, in sleepless nights, in the ache of a mother's heart." No one spoke for a while. The fire popped softly, the fog outside pressing gently against the window panes. At last, Miss Marple rose, folding her hands before her. "The cruelest truths," she said, her tone as gentle as it was certain, "are those meant to protect love. But even love cannot grow in the dark forever." She turned to Mrs. Alder and her son. "You've both suffered enough. Now let the light do what it always does, heal." The clock struck the hour. The meeting ended not with condemnation but with silence, the deep, heavy silence that follows when pain begins, at last, to lift. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead like a sigh of relief, soft, forgiving, and touched with melancholy. Fog still lingered in the hollows, but above the rooftops the air had cleared just enough for the lanterns to shine again. They hung from porches and gates, their small flames trembling but unbroken, as though the village itself wished to reclaim a bit of peace from the shadows of the past night. Inside the vicarage, Inspector Craddock stood by the hearth gazing into the fire. His hat rested on the arm of the chair, his expression unusually gentle. Miss Marple sat nearby, knitting something in pale blue wool, her needles clicking softly like the ticking of a patient clock. "I suppose," Craddock said at last, "we'll call it what it truly was, an accident." The boy acted out of fear, not malice. Pike's fall was misfortune, not murder. Miss Marple nodded without looking up. "Quite right, Inspector. And perhaps justice, this time, ought to be tempered with kindness. The law can be dreadfully cold in matters of the heart." He smiled faintly. "You'd have made an excellent magistrate, Miss Marple. Half the county would have gone free, but all of them would have been better for it." "Oh, I doubt that," she said with a twinkle. "But one does like to see decency rewarded even in small ways. The world can't always manage justice, but it should at least strive for understanding." At that, Craddock reached for his coat. "You'll be pleased to know, then, that Mrs. Alder and her son will stay here tonight under the vicar's care. I'll make my report accordingly. No headlines, no scandal. Just a sad accident on a foggy Halloween." Miss Marple smiled gently. "A merciful ending, Inspector. And perhaps that's all this little village needs," he nodded, tipping his hat to her before stepping into the cool night. Left alone with the ticking clock, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and rose to draw the curtains. The vicarage garden shimmered faintly beyond the glass, lanterns glowing like small constellations against the mist. Villagers had gathered quietly, some carrying tea, others simply standing shoulder to shoulder, not speaking much. Mrs. Alder was there among them, pale but calm, her son beside her. They watched the lights sway gently in the night air. No one avoided them now. No one whispered. The past had been heard, and, in its way, forgiven. Miss Marple watched from the window for a moment, her eyes softening. She thought of all the tragedies she had seen, so many caused not by wickedness, but by fear, shame, or desperate love. People so rarely intended harm. They merely failed to see how far secrets could burn when left untended. She murmured to herself, "Every secret burns differently." A few moments later, there was a knock at her door. Mrs. Alder entered, hat in hand.
Eyes red, but steady. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly.
"Not just for finding out the truth, but for sparing us from it in the cruel way others might have." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, "the truth is seldom cruel.
It is only our fear of it that hurts."
"You've been very brave." Mrs. Alder hesitated.
"And Tom?"
"He'll be all right," Miss Marple said. "Boys who act out of love tend to grow into men who live by conscience. Let him learn and let the world forgive. That's the only way it ever gets better." Tears welled in the widow's eyes, but they were tears of release. She nodded, whispered her thanks once more, and stepped back into the fog. Miss Marple stood by the window again, watching the lanterns flicker, small flames dancing against the cool mist. For a moment, she imagined the village years from now, children laughing under the same trees, the same cottages glowing with warmth. Life would go on,
as it always did in St. Mary Mead, quietly, steadily,
beneath the watchful eyes of those who noticed what others missed. And as the last flame flickered against the darkness, Miss Marple smiled, because she knew as surely as anyone could that every light, no matter how small, holds the power to turn secrets into peace.